All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. This is our DevCast series for 2023. This is the first one of this year. We did not have one in January. And we're going to start out with an Ask Me Everything session this time. So you guys are going to put me on the spot right away. I've got a few questions that folks have asked ahead of time. We had a form to submit that you could ask ahead of time. So I'll go through those and then I'll open it up. If you have a question that you would like answered and you didn't post it ahead of time, go ahead and put it in the Q&A section. Use the Q&A button on Zoom to post it into there, and we'll get going with that. Before we go any further, as always, have just a few logistics here. I'll have a 10-minute Q&A. This whole thing's going to be a Q&A. So at the end, we'll kind of wrap up with a little finish there. And we are recording this. It will be posted on our YouTube channel. You can see the DevCast series as well as some of our other video series if you go to our developer center at developer.genesys.cloud/video. And with that, let me stop sharing. All right, so before we get into answering the questions, I want to show you all two ways that you can ask questions at any time. You do not have to wait for these sessions. You can come to the Developer Center, developer.genesys.cloud, and right here on the landing page, there's a big area called Forum. If you click on the forum, that will take you to our Developer Forum website. And pardon the load times. All right, this is our Developer Center forum. So the team here at Genesys that builds our Developer Center, they are the main moderations of the forum site as well as teams like mine, the developer evangelists pay attention to this, the product managers monitor this, the developers of the various systems at Genesys monitor this and answer questions. I would say, as you can see, the primary area is the platform API. That's if you have an API question, you're using one of our APIs, you have a question about how to use it, or it's not functioning right, or it doesn't seem to be functioning right anyway. You can post into that. If you got questions about web messaging, we have sections on that, data actions, web chat, anything you can think of, we've got a place. And more importantly, we have announcements. So as we are changing things, we make announcements into the announcements section. And if you create a login, you can request notifications. So you can get notifications of those announcements sent to your inbox. So you'll know when we're maybe tweaking an API or deprecating an API or something like that. So the developer forum's very developer focused, right? If you're writing an application, if you are coding, this is probably the place to come to ask your question. Now there are other types of questions that are kind of developer related. Maybe you're working with the APIs, but you're not really coding up an application, or you're wanting to do something. The Genesys Community is probably the better place to ask that question. So community.genesys.com is a more general purpose set of forums here. We've got a forum for Genesys Cloud specifically that you can post in. Hey, I'm trying to do X, and I need some feedback on what's the best way that others have solved that question or solved that problem. They do a Q&A show out here of their own on the community center. We have other communities for like Genesys Engage and Multi-Cloud and Pure Connect if you're on one of those platforms. And then we've just got some fun forums as well. Genesys Casual is kind of interesting and so on. So, use those to ask your questions. The community is really cool because it's a collection of customers and partners, and you are probably not the first one trying to do something, and others are more than happy to chime in and give you their 2 cents on, hey, I tried to do that too, and it didn't work for me this way, but I was able to accomplish it this way. And so make use of those. So with that, I do have a couple of questions. I just have 3 questions that were posted ahead of time. And the first one is from Mike John. I'm not sure if Mike is on here right now, but since we're recording this, hopefully he'll be able to see this. And his question, I'm going to read it so that you all have some background here. It says, thanks for offering this. I'm not an API developer, more of a network admin background. I live mostly in API Explorer, so it uses our tools to execute some APIs. I see that to effectively use APIs, I should string together, let me make this a little bigger. I should string together a few API requests to complete the task at hand. How does someone string them together? So Mike's probably not a coder. He's not going to have the tools that a coder would have to put API requests together. And for example, I want to delete a number range, remove DIDs configured to a call routing object, and then post new number range and assign them to call routing. Another example might be remove a role from a set of users, but identify the set of users whom have a DID or not. I know it's more of a project than a simple question. I think it's really how to string APIs together. So with that, if I were in Mike's shoes as maybe not a power developer, maybe not a developer at all, but need to make use of some of the API functionality, what I would do is use our command line tools. So let me show you where that's at. I'll show you where to find the docs first. So I'm just going to come in here and under down. So the top part, the topics are more about our APIs. The resources are more about different aspects of our platform that developers would be interested in. And under developer applications, we have the platform API CLI. CLI is our command line interface, CLI, command line interface. This is a set of tools that would be used by a network admin, by a telco admin, by somebody who just needs to do some quick and dirty bulk stuff in Genesys Cloud, but doesn't want to write an application, okay? So you can install the command line tools as it implies that you're going to work at the command line level, or maybe in a easy script. If you're on Windows, PowerShell. If you're on Linux or Mac, you're probably in a Bash shell script or something like that. So we've got different ways to install it. If you're going to program in Go, you can use those. But if you're on Linux, here's how to use curl. Here you can download it and install it for Windows, and for Mac you can use Brew. I'm obviously on a Mac, so I used Brew. I got that set up, and then you can set up a new profile. The profile is going to ask you, I don't know, a handful of questions to make. Really, what it wants to know is, what is the OAuth client ID and secret that I should use to execute API requests? So let me pop up a terminal window. Let me show you this a little bit. So I've already run through Brew install because I'm on a Mac, and let me see if I can make this not such a eye chart. File, let's change this to like 18. Let's see how that looks here for y'all. All right, regular font. Let me bring up a new terminal window with a bigger font. That'll help. All right. So I already ran through the Brew install, and I've got Genesys Cloud command line tools installed. So GC is the command. And if you just type GC at the command line, you get how to use it. And it's GC plus the command. Here's the available command. So the commands tie to our APIs, essentially our API categories of what you can do and what you can get. And you don't have to kind of play with those to figure them out. We tell you about them right here. So if you scroll on through, here's some examples of how to get a list of queues. So let's just go get a list of queues. I'm going to copy that command, and I'm going to come over here to my command line, and I'm just going to drop that in, and I'm going to run that. And voila, there is a list of queues that I get at the command line for my contact center. So actually, before I run that, let me show you. So GC profiles new. So it wants to set up a new profile. I might call this Crispino. And my environment, this is where your org is hosted. This is mine is in the US East region. So my domain where I log into Genesys Cloud is mypurecloud.com. You might be on usw2.pure.cloud. You might be in the EU West1.pure.cloud, etc. So based on what's your URL for accessing Genesys, you put that in there. If you have a predefined access token, you can put that in here. I would recommend not to do that. Access tokens can expire, so I would go buy that one. Then it wants to know what kind of OAuth client do you want to use for API requests. And I'm using Client Credentials Grant, and I got a client ID and a secret. I've already set all this up, so mine's already pre-configured, and that's why I can run that command line and get my list of queues. Now, as Mike was asking, okay, great, I can run this and I can get some output here, and what do I do with it now, right? I want to string a couple of them together. Well, since this is the command line, and especially if you're in something like PowerShell or a bash script or something like that, you can take the output from one API and pipe it into, like with bash script, pipe it into another, pipe it to a file, and then use that file as input to the next API request. I'm not a Windows user, so I don't know PowerShell all that well, but I know that it can be used from PowerShell, and you can do similar things as you can on Linux and Mac. So if it were me, I would take a look at the CLI and really kind of follow through all of this documentation. So we give you some good examples. We go over notifications, alternate formats. So feeding data into, say, an API request. The format of that data can be JSON or YAML, depending on what you're comfortable with. So JSON's more curly braces and commas and quotes and things like that, where YAML is more of a positional indentation kind of format of specifying an object. So if you have to define an object as an input to an API request, you might choose one format over the other that you're more comfortable with. So, here's how to do an analytics query. You want to query the analytics system for a certain conversation or a date range of conversations that have ended. So your input would be the query, right? What you want, when, sorted by, etc. In the query YAML, you tell it that it's a YAML file, and you send that into the analytics query, and it'll get that for you. You can also take the output. The output can come out in a couple of different ways. Let's see, they talk about transforming it here. So transforming data. So you're going to get output, obviously, and you saw in my screenshot, my request for queues came out as JSON, which is convenient in certain cases, but you might want it in different formats. So you can set up how to format that data in template files. You could format it to a CSV file so that you can bring it into Excel, etc. It's a very powerful set of tools. So I'm not going to solve Mike's problems here. I just wanted to show you that that's available. So if you don't really want to write code, if you don't want to download Visual Studio Code and learn how to write code, and you're more comfortable just in shell scripts and PowerShell, the CLI is the way to go. It can really make some of those more administrative tasks a little easier to solve. All right, the next question I have is from Charles Scoron. He has several questions, and they're not so much development questions. I'll try to answer these, Charles, as best I can. You asked, when will nested arrays be supported in Architect? The data actions support it. You're right. Data actions can handle nested arrays of data. And we have several orgs where it would simplify the integration quite a bit if it would support nested arrays. I don't have an answer. I'm not the product manager for Architect. If you post that same question onto the community forum, I know that Maisie Harris is one of our Architect people who, oh no, Melissa Bailey, sorry, Melissa Bailey. You'll see her answer Architect questions a lot on the community forum. So if you post that in there, she'll probably be able to answer that much better than I would. It's gonna, I don't know if they'll ever support it, honestly. If you think about Architect is designed for the business users to empower business users to be able to create call flows. It's business users probably do not know what a nested array is or understand what a nested array is. So data actions and Architect have a pretty interesting relationship. Data actions, they're meant to make an HTTP request somewhere or get some data from somewhere and make it available in Architect. But it does that through input contracts and output contracts. So those are the contracts are the glue between Architect and data actions. And they're meant to hide or obscure the complexity of an API request in a data action to make the data returned from that more easily consumable in an Architect call flow. The idea is on a data action, you should be using a template to take that response from the HTTP request and break it up into items that you need into like simpler arrays or something like that, so that you can then consume that more easily as a business user in Architect. So, hopefully that answered that question. Again, post that on the community forum and you'll probably get a better answer for when, if and when they might be supported in Architect. When using the screen, so he's got 3 questions here. This is the second one. When using the screen pop option in Architect, any variable that is used and passed to the UI becomes participant data and is stored as part of the interaction itself. Because of this, we cannot put any PII data into those fields. Is there any way around this, or is there a plan to be able to have the data passed to the UI as a variable without having it stored as part of the historical interaction details? I should have thought of this ahead of time. I did glance at these, but I did not prepare answers. So the way a call travels through Genesys is there is a conversation JSON object. It's when the call lands at Genesys, we create an object, and every component of our system that touches that conversation, the IVR, the queue, the caller, the agent, any service or human that touches that conversation has the ability to alter that conversation JSON. And that's why we can attach data in Architect and we can get it in the user interface of the agent who's handling it, because it's traveling with that JSON object. At this time, the only way to get data from Architect to the UI is through participant attributes. And they're called participant attributes because every human or service that touches it has a participant entry in the participant array of the conversation JSON. And so the IVR participant will put data on there that the agent participant can go and pull. You're right about attaching PII data. It's probably not the best way to do that as attaching it as participant data, because you're right. Participant data is stored historically in our historical system, and it can be queried by the analytics system through the jobs API and used on reports and things like that. But if it's PII data, I think what I would do is store that data in some secure PII system and add a reference, add a identifier to get to that data, and add that as participant data in Architect. Pass it along to the screen pop, and if you're using like Genesys scripting, you can execute a data action in the script to take that ID, go get the participant attributes that are, or not participant attributes, call a data action that would go out to that system and get that PII data. It will be transient at that point, right? It won't be stored with the conversation JSON. You're going to have to go get that on the fly in the script and then display it in the script. But after the script is done, after that conversation is done, all of that data is wiped away and not stored historically with Genesys Cloud. So that's the most safe way to store PII data, is to have it stored in its system of record and go pull it as needed, but don't attach it to that long-lived call structure that's going to be stored in the historical data. So hopefully that answers that one. And then the last one from Charles is there a way to still be able to encrypt specific variables in a flow instead of having to use a secure flow, which limits troubleshooting capabilities? Will the encrypt data action support this? I don't know that I have an answer to that question. That would probably be a good one to ask in the community forum as well. I do know that they're talking about, or it might actually be out now, we're talking about being able to encrypt participant data, I believe, or adding encryption routines to some of the blocks in Genesys Architect. So alternatively, you could call some third-party service that would encrypt something and put the encrypted value as participant data. You'd have to decrypt it when you want to see it. It wouldn't be any good in reporting. You could query on it, but it could be there. It's probably a longer conversation on how to do that. That's why the community forum might be a good one for that one, because there are multiple ways to do that. There are some ways that are better than others that might not be as obvious. All right, so that, I think, hopefully, Charles, I'm sorry if I didn't answer everything. If you have more questions, let us know. The last one is from Steve Masisto. So this was a good one. Is it possible to receive email notifications when our org receives a specific outbound campaign wrap-up code? For example, we found that we received the following wrap-up codes, in-outbound-ambiguous, when the following event occurs. And he goes into this event. We would like to be alerted in real time when these wrap-up codes occur. Is there an API notification that can be set for this? So, yes. Yes, there is. And I actually touched on this topic in the November, I think it was the November DevCast. So there's a couple of ways to do this, Steve. And being notified in real time, there's a couple of ways. Let's just dig into it and talk about it. So first of all, how would you be able to trigger when you get that wrap-up code? So let's look at that. So I'm going to hop over here to the Dev Center. I'm going to go back to the landing page. I'll go into the API Explorer. And first of all, you've got to be able to trigger off of that event. So under notifications and alerts and notifications, there's available topics. We've got 3 different mechanisms to get event notifications. And I'm assuming you don't really want to write code and host it somewhere that would always be listening to Genesys. There are ways to do that. If you are an Amazon shop and you have an Amazon account and you want to use Amazon Event Bridge, that would be a great mechanism. We could send an event to Event Bridge that would trigger on the wrap-up code, and you could have a Lambda that fires and does whatever you want to do when you get that in-outbound-ambiguous. wrap-up code. So what if you don't want to host code, I would recommend go look at our new process automation API. So it's also called triggers. You might hear it called triggers from time to time, but that is triggers and process automation are the ability for Genesys Cloud for you to go in and define, and if this happens, if you see this event, then perform this action. And if you check process automation, you'll see the events that are available. And your specific, Steve, your specific request was on wrap-up code. So we do have an event, v2.details.events.conversation.id.wrapup. So this would be when a conversation wraps up, you'll receive an event about it, and you'll be able to do something based on that wrap-up code. You could even go so far as possibly in the trigger to filter to only trigger on that specific wrap-up code. But at the very least, you could have all wrap-up codes fire the event and filter in your action. So if you look at this, I mean, well, there's not much to look at, but you'll be able to see the event schema that you would receive. I don't think the wrap-up code, oh, it is in there. So the wrap-up code is in there. So you could write a trigger. So let's go look at platform, process automation, and triggers. So this is how you would set up the trigger. You create a match, and I'm not going to go into triggers because I went into great detail on the previous DevCast. Go out to the YouTube channel and go look at that one, and you'll be able to see how to set up a trigger that when you see the in-outbound-ambiguous wrap-up code, you can execute an architect workflow. So a workflow is like a call flow. It's just a set of blocks that execute when requested. So when that wrap-up code fires, you can run that workflow, and that workflow could notify you that that wrap-up code happened, right? And so in this case, when that wrap-up code happens, it's something with the edge, which is why Steve wants to hop in there, because it's something with the telephony that might need to be addressed. So when you're in the workflow that's executing the blocks of the workflow, there's a couple of things you can do. You can use Genesys Cloud. If you have an SMS number, if you have bought an SMS number, let me show you. Let me go to my org. You can call an agent, the agentless messaging API, to send an SMS text message to a specific number or numbers. You could call the API multiple times to do that. So first, you would have to go under messaging and under SMS number inventory, and you'd have to buy an SMS phone number so that you would have a number, and then you could go to the conversation handling conversation API, and we'll put in agentless, and we have messages agentless. This allows you to send an outbound message that does not require an agent. So you can send a from, a to, an SMS and a body. That's I mean, that exactly will send your SMS message to the user. And so you could send that, you could call that multiple times for different phone numbers and send SMS triggers to Genesys. The other thing you could do is in the workflow, you could post into a Genesys Cloud chat room. So if I look at webhooks, let's see, where are webhooks? Webhooks. So you could use our webhook API to post a message into a Genesys Cloud chat room. So that would look like this. If you go to the chat widget on Genesys, and you go to, is it the developer support one? Yeah, see here I was posting messages into this chat room from our webhook API. So that would notify you via Genesys chat. You can even at a group or at a person in the message, like well, that's my email, but here, like at John Carnell. If you at somebody, they will get notified, through their notifications on their desktop that a message has come in for them. The other option is on the App Foundry, appfoundry.genesys.com. You could use a system like PagerDuty, which is what Genesys uses. We use this on our own system, so that when our build fails, or edges are down, or whatever, some system is showing failure, we use PagerDuty, and PagerDuty is another system. You got to go buy a subscription to that, and your workflow. So let's say the in, outbound, ambiguous wrap-up code fires. It runs your workflow. Your workflow can call a data action to notify PagerDuty that some activity happened. And in PagerDuty, you could set up, okay, I want to email this person. I want to send out texts to these people. I want to notify these people over Teams or something like that. You've got a lot of flexibility in PagerDuty. Of course, you have to, again, pay for a subscription. But if this is critical to your business, that might be a small price to pay to go get a PagerDuty subscription and be able to notify a bunch of people based on actions that happen within your contact center. So, oh my goodness, I've got 13 other questions in the Q&A. I'm obviously not going to get to those. So Steve, I hope that answered your question. Again, if you have more questions, that one, you could post that in either the forum, the developer forums, or the community forums, or both. I think you'd get some interesting questions from both groups, or interesting answers from both groups. All right, I'm going to try and power through some of these. So it's Gomez on the web messenger experience. Can we have a form before the chat starts? Lots of people ask for this. I don't believe it's something we're going to add. I know that web chat had that pre-chat form. You could put in your first and last name, your email address, and the subject that you were interested in. With web messaging, usually I see it recommended that you use Genesys Dialog Engine bot flows. Have a bot launch when that web messaging interaction starts, and have that bot collect that information. If you want to ask for first name and last name and email address and subject, have the bot ask for that as a chat transaction, as a chat transcript, right? Messages back and forth. Have the bot collect that as slots for an intent, and then you can route that, right? So you don't necessarily have a pre-chat form ahead of time. The chat form is built into the chat. It actually is a part of the chat conversation to collect that data. The agent will be able to see it. It'll travel as participant data with the chat, or with the messaging conversation, and but it gives you a lot more flexibility in what you can do with the bot. So I believe that's the approach that is suggested. All right. Next one, I'm not going to try and butcher the name. I'm sorry, I can't get that. The question is there a way to add skills to users in bulk, similar to adding queues? Again, this is another common request. Right now, there's not a way to add skills in bulk. What I would recommend is using the command line interface that I talked about earlier to potentially do that in a bulk manner. It would be one by one, but you could build a little routine that would take, say, a CSV spreadsheet of skills and users to assign, and use the CLI to write a little script that would power through that Excel spreadsheet and make the appropriate skill assignments to the users in Genesys Cloud. I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't some future enhancement to do bulk skill assignments. It's a very common request. We even have a few App Foundry vendors that would do that. They have an interface they've built specifically for that, because it is a gap that we have in our user interface right now. So if you go out to the App Foundry and search for bulk or skills or something like that, I think you'll find a few utilities. Some aren't very much money. Others are very powerful and do quite a bit of stuff. So you can your mileage may vary there. All right. So the next question we have is, upgrading the chat from web chat to web messaging requires an additional web development besides including the script. It's a question, does it require any additional? No, it does not. So both technologies had a script to embed. Let's go look at that. So if I go look at, here's my org. So if I go to web messaging, messenger deployments, I can't remember if it's in deployments or configuration. I think it's in deployments. So here is the code that you can copy to the clipboard and then save somewhere and then go put it in your website. You can put it in I forget what Google calls them. Google's got some templates. If you're using Google Analytics, which a lot of people are, you can put them in the header templates so that they're on every page, or you could go actually modify pages on your website and deploy that script. It is similar to the script that you would deploy for web chat. It's just a different script. It calls different APIs on Genesys to launch that, but it should be an easy switch to kind of put web messaging onto a website versus web chat. If you want to play with that ahead of time, if you want to kind of see what that would look like, there are tools like TamperMonkey. I use TamperMonkey. It's a Chrome extension that you can inject any script onto any website. I don't know that I have one. I just got a new machine, so I don't have my old scripts on here. But TamperMonkey is really cool because you can say, if the URL is Genesys or developer.genesys.cloud, then inject this script, and you can literally like copy that clipboard script and put that into your TamperMonkey script and have that injected, and you can play with web messaging right there on your website and see what that would look like. So you can know that your script will work also if you manually embed it. So I hope that answers that. Can we? So Edson looks like he's making the move from web chat to web messaging. He says, can we connect the web form details to the user details on the website? I'm guessing that means, can you do authenticated web messaging? I think you can now do authenticated web messaging. Let's see. We didn't initially have that about web messaging. Web chat. Enable authenticated web messaging. So this would be the key. Authenticated means you have a user that you know. It's not an anonymous user on your website. So the user has logged into your website. You know who the user is. You could use that with web messaging to pass that information about who the authenticated user is through web messaging. All right, and at what point in the chat interaction will the data be sent to the CRM? Can we also map the experience with email marketing? So I would do that in the messaging flow in Genesys Cloud. I would use data actions. So as that web messaging interaction comes into Genesys Cloud, You can hit your CRM to look up more information about that user. You could pass information to the CRM to tell you that that user logged an activity, chatting with the contact center. You can also send that to an email marketing campaign that the user clicked on a chat. You can feed that into a Genesys email campaign or a regular voice campaign or something like that. So that's what I would do. I would do it in the messaging flow of Architect for that. All right, we got one from Dan Fontaine. Looking to automate playing this call will be recorded for outbound calls made on behalf of a queue. Can V2 details, events, conversation ID, conversation start be used? That is, does that event indicate for outbound calls made on behalf of a queue when a customer answers the outbound call, or does start happen when the call is placed? You know, I've used that start event, the customer.start event for inbound. I don't think I've ever used it for an outbound, but I do know the customer participant does not get added until a human is identified, until call progress detection identifies the human and adds that participant in. I think the only participant on the call is still the dialer. So as the dialer is calling the number and trying to identify, did I get a sit tone? Did I get an answering machine? Did I get a busy? Once it gets a human and somebody answers and it recognizes it as a human versus an answering machine, I think that's when the customer start happens. But then as far as playing this call will be recorded, I kind of feel like you'd have to do that on an agentless outbound campaign. So what that is you guys have probably all received these calls from, say, your doctor reminding you of an appointment, right? No humans on the phone. It's a recording that's played to you. I think your outbound voice campaign would have to be an agentless voice campaign that would dial the call. When the human answers, an outbound call flow will execute. You can play that. This call will be recorded, and then do a transfer to a queue of agents for that outbound campaign. And just like an inbound call, the first available or whatever your routing is, that agent will answer it. I don't think using the trigger is going to benefit you at all, because there's no way that I know of through a trigger that you can play audio over a conversation. So I could be wrong on that. I don't know everything. I know enough to make myself dangerous. I know a little about a lot, but there may be other ways to do that. Dan, you might pop that into the community chat and ask about how someone would play this call will be recorded on an outbound campaign, and see if somebody's got some better ideas than maybe using an agentless campaign. All right, we got a couple more. Edson, okay, Edson, sorry. So Edson's posting again. How flexible is the web messenger chat box design? Can we apply CSS? So if you look at web messaging, let me get back. Here it is. So messenger configurations. This is where you set up what the box will look like, what the chat box on the website will look like. And there's not a lot of flexibility. You can kind of tweak the colors and stuff right here in this UI. But that's about the extent you have, as far as I know, to alter the design of the chat box for web messaging. So it's designed to be very user focused, easy to do. That's why we have a UI for managing what it looks like, instead of having to go in and tweak code to manage the look and feel of it. So, all right. Dan Fontaine, again, I'm always super confused by what value to put in authorized redirect URIs for OAuth. What is the value typically? When does it vary? So if we go to admin and we go to OAuth, add a client, and to do redirects. So there's two OAuth client types that will do redirects. There's implicit grant and authorization code grant. Implicit grant is meant for a client side, all client side HTML and JavaScript kind of solution, whereas authorization code grant is meant more for a server side, like .NET ASP or PHP, or I'm showing my technology there, Java, a Java server app or something like that. So either one of those two redirects. So the flow is a user needs to log in. They leave the site they're on. They're transferred to Genesys Cloud. They enter their credentials on Genesys Cloud. When they're transferred to Genesys Cloud, there's a redirect URL that is sent along with it, so that once they authenticate, Genesys Cloud can pass them back to the original site or the original page on an implicit grant. And we need to know the URL to pass them back to. And so if I do just an implicit, let's see. And I do implicit grant, I would want to put in usually HTTPS. It doesn't have to be, but usually some secure site because they just logged in. mydomain.com/ and this has to be on an implicit grant. Okay, so this is HTML and JavaScript on the client side. It's got to go all the way down to the page. So you might say my site, my page.html, all the way. It's got to resolve all the way to the exact URL that it's going to land at. Okay. It needs to do that at least for implicit grant. Now, if you were doing authorization code grant, you could probably leave it at something where you don't have the page, because you've got you might have just a path to execute a server-side script, a Node.js script or something like that. You might have .aspx on there, you might have .php. It just kind of depends on what is the URL that Genesys Cloud is going to redirect back to, and it's got to fully resolve. It has to be the exact URL so that our SDK, when it gets that access token back, can validate that it came back to the right place. And when you're authenticating, where you're coming from, you're passing in the redirect URL, and we're going to check it. We're going to look on this. You can have multiple URLs, but we're going to check and make sure it's one of the ones that you list here. So it has to match. If you're coming from a specific page or a specific path, if that's what you passed in, it's got to match here, and Genesys has to be able to get back to that as a result. So, Dan, I hope that answered that. If not, put something in the developer forum, and we'll clarify that a little more for you. Robert, you are answering the encryption thing, I think. Robert Wakefield posted in the Q&A, he said, I'm thinking he's answering the encryption of participant data was released 2 weeks ago using base 64 encoding. So actually, let's go. Let me show you where you can find that kind of stuff. So if you go to the documentation and release notes, maybe it'll be there. We don't, not everything, Genesys Cloud release notes. So we do release notes by every 2 weeks. We have a release cycle every 2 weeks. You're right, Robert. I remember seeing, there we go, encrypt and decrypt data in architect flows. So if we click on February 28th, encrypt and decrypt data in architect flows, this will show you kind of how to do everything. So you can follow those articles and take a look at that. Thank you, Robert. You're always Robert is very active on the community forum as well. You're likely to see him chime in and answer questions. All right. For event triggers, when is the UI going to be available as opposed to having to create a trigger via the API? Josh, I don't have the answer to that question. I wish I knew. It is not high on the roadmap. Unfortunately, there's some other higher priority items to get done that team is working on. So I don't have a feeling that there's going to be a UI anytime soon. So I wish I had an answer for you. I think right now it's going to have to stick with the APIs. So interestingly enough, when I did my talk about triggers a couple months ago, I actually thought about writing a really quick and dirty user interface to help me manage my own triggers. So if one of you happen to do that, let us know. We could create a blog post or a blueprint on, if you create a little UI to help manage triggers and make it available on like GitHub Pages, which is free to host a client-side app, that'd be pretty cool. We could share that as a blueprint. We could all take advantage of that. All right. With the HIPAA-enabled restrictions, so this is from Ebony de la Torre Ventura. With the HIPAA-enabled restrictions being applied on a platform, will there be any way to encrypt email notifications or trigger SMS so that it is HIPAA compliant via API or any other way? Ebony, I don't have an answer for that. I am not totally familiar with what our HIPAA enabling on an org does and what that affects. I'm afraid I don't have any personal experience with that, so I couldn't even hazard a guess. Post that into the community forum though. I'm guessing there are a number of customers and partners that have HIPAA enabled their org, and they probably can answer those questions for you. So is there a way, so along the same lines, is there a way via API to be able to toggle secure pause on and off on a conversation level? I believe there is. I believe it. So you can't do it from a server, I don't think. Most of the conversation handling APIs like muting, putting a call on hold, kind of all of that. And I think including secure pause, I think those require a user context, which means code would have to execute under that specific agent. So you'd have to have like some kind of interaction widget or something that would toggle that on. But there is a patch request, a patch API for the conversation, that specific conversation, that you could probably call to do a secure pause. I think I'd post that in the developer forum and see how far you get with that. I actually don't have a lot of experience with secure pause either. Most of the stuff I do is very open, very out there. I'm not well versed in all the security aspects necessarily of compliance with HIPAA. So, all right. Matthew Raleigh, there is also a tool on the developer site to test web messaging. You're right, Matthew. So Edson, since you're doing web messaging, you may or may not know this already. So I've shown you some docs on the resource center, but if you go to the developer center and you go, just click on one of these to get to this view, go down to the bottom, and under resources, under developer applications, there's web chat and messaging tools. So we've wrapped up web chat and web messaging. And if you log into your org, my org's on US East 1. Give it a second. once you log in, it will read your org and it will find any configuration you have set up for web messaging or web chat. And you'll be able to select those. So in this case, I'm on Web Messenger, so I could select this deployment for web messaging, and I can start that. And what it does is in this frame down here, it should, if I've got everything configured right, there it is. It launches web messaging configured with the configuration I have. I can also do web chat. So I can come over here and do DevCast chat with my queue, and it's got some pre-populated fields. If I hit start chat, it's a lot of scrolling, but so there's our older web chat with the pre-chat form, and I can start that chat and kind of get that going. So thank you, Matthew, for pointing that out. I'm glad we got to show that. Edward Vander Linden. I would like to see a queue. I would like to see the queue a web message was handled before when it isn't a new conversation. I would like to see the queue web message was handled before when it isn't a new conversation. So I'm guessing you're asking, you've got a long-lived asynchronous conversation under web messaging, like they came back maybe. They were on the website, they came back an hour later, 2 hours later, they're chatting again. In the message flow, it's questionable whether a new message flow will fire or not. There are some thresholds that have to be reached to have it run a new messaging flow on an existing web message. But if it does run a new web messaging flow, you can use the API to query the conversation JSON for that web message and look and see what the previous disconnected queue was, so that you could then maybe route again to that same queue. We should do that if it doesn't run through web messaging. It should do that automatically, I believe. It'll resurrect that conversation and try and direct it to at least the same queue, potentially even the same user. But if you need to do it manually and you're in a message flow, you can use a data action, a Genesys Cloud data action specifically, to go hit the API to get the previous conversation JSON and look at the queue. All right, we're getting through them. They keep coming in. We're running out of time. We're actually at time. So I've got a few more to go through. I think what I'll do is I'll take these offline and I'll post them in the comments on the Ask Me Anything YouTube channel. So if you follow them there, I will get you answers via that. Also, if you don't want to wait for an answer, go post them on the community or the developer center, and we'll get them answered that way as well. So thank you all for joining. I'm sorry I ran you over a little bit. We'll catch you next month. Watch for the next developer newsletter for our next DevCast. All right. Thanks. Catch you later. Bye-bye.